Welcome to Homeschool Nolan, here to help you navigate learning in the digital age. When I was 6 years old, my parents started sending me to Chinese school on the weekends. Now, as a kid growing up in America, I just didn't see the value of learning how to read and write Chinese at the time. I remember asking my dad why I had to go to Chinese school. And he said that one day, so that maybe I could grow up and become an ambassador or a translator. Now, at the time, that just didn't sound very convincing to me. But now, years later, learning how to read and write Chinese has become one of those subjects that I appreciate now that I'm older. First, there are the practical reasons. Even though I only recognize a few hundred Chinese characters, it still comes in very handy whenever I visit China or Taiwan and I need to find my way around or read the menu at a restaurant. But beyond that, there are other reasons to study Chinese characters and this fascinating writing system. For one, the country we know as China is the longest continuous civilization in the world, stretching back thousands of years. But interestingly, there is no one spoken language known as Chinese. The official language of China today is Mandarin or Putonghua, which is a dialect of Chinese. In fact, there are at least 6 major dialects and 300 individual languages spoken all across China. What unifies the people of China together across many different dialects and across thousands of years is the written language. And what's really fascinating is that even though Chinese characters can be pronounced differently under different dialects, they always have the same meaning, kind of like Arabic numerals. Without this common written language, the country we know as China today probably wouldn't exist. Instead, it would likely be split into many different countries with their own languages, just like Europe is. And the man we can thank most for that was China's first emperor Qin Shi Huang, for putting in place one written language for all of China in the 3rd century BC. And largely because of its language, for thousands of years, China was the preeminent civilization of the world. It was the Chinese who invented the compass, gunpowder, as well as paper and printing, so they could pass down written knowledge from one generation to the next. China today, of course, is a very important and influential country on the world stage, home to 1.4 billion people, or about 20% of the world's population. But many in the West still don't quite understand China because they try to see it through a Western lens. To really understand a country, you need to understand its history. And to understand its history, it helps a lot if you can actually read its history in its own language. Now, I consider myself an amateur Chinese historian, but as an English-speaking person, I rely on history books written in English to study China. And I've come to realize that I'm probably missing out on being able to read a lot of great historical texts that are written in Chinese. I think studying Chinese history without knowing how to read Chinese would be almost like trying to study British or American history without being able to read any English. You're going to be missing out on a lot of important primary and original historical documents. Now that said, studying Chinese, especially if you're not Chinese, is hard. This written language is based on thousands of pictographs and ideograms that you have to memorize. There are over 50,000 Chinese characters, and you need to know at least 2,000 of them to read a newspaper. And each character can take as many as 13 or more brushstrokes to write. Memorizing all these characters is, of course, much harder and takes more time than, say, learning 26 letters of the alphabet. The difficulty of learning how to read and write Chinese has always placed a higher barrier to being educated in China. And that probably explains why being educated has always been considered a higher accomplishment and more prestigious in Chinese culture. But once you learn the Chinese language, it's hard not to notice and appreciate its aesthetic beauty. Chinese calligraphy can be found on the walls of many Chinese homes. Years ago, a friend of mine gave me this piece of Chinese calligraphy to hang on my wall. Even though I don't recognize about half the characters, I always appreciate the serenity and the aesthetic beauty of these characters hanging on my wall. Because Chinese characters are based on pictograms and ideograms, each character can have its own fascinating meanings. And I didn't really appreciate this until I was in college. Many years ago, as a college student, when I was studying Mandarin Chinese in Taipei, Taiwan over the summer, I met a Christian missionary from Australia. He too was studying Mandarin Chinese, but his goal was to one day share the gospel in China. And then one day, he showed me this interesting book titled The Discovery of Genesis. On the cover is the character for Zhao, or create. This character is apparently made up of at least 3 other components. First, there's the word for mud, the word for mouth, and the radical for being able to walk. Together, this character apparently tells a story from Genesis 2:7, which talks about how the Lord formed man of the dust and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Now, this book does try to give many other examples of how Chinese writing must have been invented by people who had knowledge of the events of Genesis as described in the Bible. Now, whether you believe this or not, books like these at least make you think about and appreciate the meaning behind a language based on pictographs and ideograms. As I mentioned earlier, learning thousands of Chinese characters can take years, and it's been a barrier to many people getting educated over the centuries. To address this, the Chinese government in the 50s and 60s introduced a simplified version of Chinese characters, aptly called Simplified Chinese. In Simplified Chinese, the number of brushstrokes needed to write many of the most common characters has been reduced. Some feel, though, that the simplified characters take away some of the artistic meaning. Now, as someone who grew up learning the traditional characters, I have a personal bias towards learning traditional Chinese first if you want to study older texts, especially those written before the 1950s. But if your goal is to communicate through writing with as many Chinese people today, then learning simplified characters may be the way to go. Now, if you're learning Chinese for the first time, there are 2 popular systems you can use to help you learn how to pronounce Chinese characters. The first is Pinyin, which uses a Latin alphabet to help you learn the pronunciation of Chinese words using familiar letters. The second system is called Zhuyin, which uses a different type of alphabet based on Chinese symbols. Now, Zhuyin is a system I used as a kid. Zhuyin will take most Westerners longer to learn, but because it uses native Chinese symbols, the pronunciations are more accurate. Pinyin is faster to learn for Westerners who are used to the Latin alphabet, but because it uses the Latin alphabet, there's always the temptation or the tendency for learners to use English pronunciations instead of more accurate Chinese pronunciations. If you're not sure which system is the right one for you, you can try both. Last summer when I was in Taiwan, I bought this set of flashcards for learning Chinese for my 6-year-old. Each of the flashcards in this set comes with both the Pinyin and the Zhuyin pronunciation of each character. Now, even though my kids growing up here in America may never need to learn thousands of characters to read a newspaper, my wife and I will continue to encourage them to learn as many characters as they can. In fact, I think anyone of any age can still benefit from learning at least a few hundred Chinese characters, especially if you plan on visiting a Chinese-speaking country. Not only will it help you develop your memorization skills, but it will also help you better appreciate and understand the longest-lasting civilization of the world. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And don't forget to click subscribe for more videos like this one. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.